Good evening, everyone. My name is Candace Lopez. I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer here at Horizons Foundation. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes as folks find their way into the Zoom room. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Again, my name is Candace Lopez. I am the Chief Philanthropy Officer here at Horizons Foundation. I hope everyone's having a good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this year's State of the Movement. We're so excited to have our guests here with us. We have a really great panel ahead of us, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I'm just here to go over a few housekeeping items. So this will be recorded and distributed. So if you have to jet out a little early, or if you miss something, you'll get this after the event, and you can watch this again if you like. Your video and mic are turned off, so you can see us, but we can't see you. Cart captioning is available for those who need it. You can access that by clicking the CC icon button below. You can toggle views. So if you want a gallery view, speaker view, side by side, there is a little icon. For those of you who are new to Zoom, unlike the rest of us who are drowning in it, there is a little icon at the top right hand of your screen where you can change your view. And then if you have questions throughout the event, use the Q&A tool to submit your questions. And then the Q&A will be at the end, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Roger.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Roger Dowdy. I'm the president of Horizons Foundation, and this is actually always one of my very favorite events of the whole year. I was just reflecting this afternoon, and I was thinking that just in the past couple of weeks, and even the last few days, we've had passage of the Respect for Marriage Act, Transgender Day of Remembrance, the terrible shootings in Colorado, arguments in a case in Arkansas about that will have major implications for trans youth's access to healthcare. Arguments, as everybody probably heard, at the Supreme Court yesterday, a major decision around religious exemptions. We're waiting to hear about the Georgia Senate race results today. There was a study released of high school principals and other principals that showed that, in their view, conditions for LGBTQ youth in schools are getting worse, and a gay California state senator received yet another death threat. And that's just in the past few days. And the next week and the next month and the next year are probably not going to be a lot different than that. And it's so easy for all of us to just get kind of overwhelmed and caught in this flood tide, of news. And it can be very hard to step back and take a look at a little bit perspective, context, some history. And that is what tonight's event is really all about. Every year since 2004, Horizons has had the privilege to hold this event, to try to create exactly that kind of opportunity, which is part of Horizons' overall commitment to providing chances for donors and community members to learn about important and timely issues. And every year we bring together a group of remarkable leaders from across the state and the movement. And this year is no different. And I will get to our wonderful speakers in just one moment. But first, I just want to say a big welcome and thank you to all of you who are joining us tonight. We had more than 300 people, our RSVP, that they're going to be attending this evening. And we received in advance more than 80 questions from all of you. So thank you for all of your interest in that. And my apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, because it is not possible for us to get to all 80 questions, but please know that they all help to inform how we put together this evening. So the format for tonight is going to be very simple. I'll pose an opening question to all of the panelists, and then a series of questions directed towards one or more of these folks. We'll have a couple questions for the whole group, and then I'll turn to more questions that have been posed by all of you, either during the course of the evening tonight in the Q&A function, or in advance of tonight from what you submitted with your registration. And then we'll just have a brief wrap up. And now I get to introduce these wonderful people. I want to welcome you, Assemblymember Evan Lowe. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. And he represents the 28th District in California, which is in Silicon Valley. And just to note, so everybody knows, the Assemblymember will have to take off a bit early this evening. So he will disappear at some point, but we'll make sure to have some time with him before then. We're also joined by James Essex, who is the longtime national director of the ACLU's LGBTQ rights and HIV project. Kiara Johnson, the executive director of the National LGBTQ Task Force, and Andy Mara, executive director of TILDA, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Welcome all of you, and thank you for making the time, especially you East Coasters, to be with us tonight. So let's just go to our first question. And my question is, for each of you, and anybody can start, for each of you, what would be the 3 words that you would use to describe the state of the LGBTQ movement, the title of tonight's event, and why would you choose those 3 words? Or it could be 2, it could be 2 or 3 words.
Okay, I'm gonna start. So, because I'm like,
thank you, Kiara.
I'm like, don't take my words. No, it's playing.
You're smart. You're smart.
I said diverse, defensive, and well-positioned. Hyphenated. Always try to get in more than 3, more than what you say is allowed. So diverse, literally diverse, right? Always have been, and representation, right? The spotlight is being shown more and more on the diverse faces, voices, experiences of LGBTQ people, diverse in race, ethnicity, age, faith traditions, right? Defensive, what I mean by that is on the defense, right? There have just been so many attacks that in many ways has forced us to be reactive in the last few years. And I think you'll likely hear a lot of yearning and planning to get proactive. And finally, well-positioned. We are one of the fastest growing electorates in the country. Regardless of what opposition would say, there is so much cultural love, right? Like we've got the hearts and minds of so many people, you know, in this country. And it's the reason we're seeing the pendulum swing. It is in direct response to how far we've come. It is in direct response to the progress that we've made. And frankly, we're only getting queerer, right? We are so well positioned, and we're in positions of leadership and influence across sectors, across movements, in entertainment, from education, right, to halls of legislative buildings, and everything in between, corporate and philanthropy and so on. So those are my 3 words.
Well, you took 3 really good ones. Okay, who's next?
I'll go. Andy Mara, she and her pronouns. I would say resilient, you know, building off of what Kiara shared. The past couple of years have been incredibly challenging for many in our community, particularly trans folks, trans young people and their families. And yet this is not the first time we've experienced opposition, pushback, and our community is still able to move forward. So I'd say resilient. Bipartisan is another word that comes to mind. I think that as we engage in conversation and dialogue tonight, I think a lot of the themes that will come up will come back to the issue of bipartisanship in light of the current composition, not just in Congress and as we're waiting on the Senate, of course, but in states across the country, our movement's going to have to pivot and think about opportunities that allow us to work on both sides of the aisle. We have been here before. We have the playbooks that we can consult, but bipartisanship is one word that comes to mind. And then I would lastly close with inspiring. In some of our darkest moments in our movement, we have seen incredible, excellent leadership from different corners of our community. And I'm particularly moved and inspired by our trans young people. These folks are unafraid of the attacks. They are boldly speaking their truth and leaning into the full authenticity of who they are and proudly advocating for themselves and the kind of world that they want to grow up in and eventually inherit from us. So those are when I get down in the dumps, I look at the young people who inspire me every day.
Thank you. James or Evan?
Well, thank you very much, Roger. And it's so fabulous to see the incredible warriors, James, Andy, Kira. Great to see you as well. 3 words, and thank you for allowing me to buy some time, but I'd say sidelines no more. So many of us in our communities hate politics. It's divisive. It's nasty. It's dirty. We don't like it. We only like to focus on the good things. But we realize that we must get in the arena and we no longer can be on the sidelines and that our livelihoods depend on it. I serve as the chair of the California LGBT Legislative Caucus, and even in California, the members of our community are weaponized each and every day. I authored legislation to prevent public taxpayer travel to states that discriminate based on sexual orientation. And 5 years ago, that list was under 10. Today, I think we're close to half of the states in the nation in which the Attorney General has compiled a list of states that discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so it's important that we realize how far we've come, but oftentimes if we aren't participating and we aren't present, we'll see the clocks turn back. And it's important that we reaffirm our commitment, and that's part of this conversation here today.
Thank you.
So that leaves me. Hi, everybody. James, you see him, and wonderful to be with all of you. So my words, I love this exercise, Roger. My words are exploited, precarious, and opportunity. Exploited because I feel like the LGBTQ folks and trans folks especially are being exploited by the right for their own political ends. The right is exploiting the country's basically lack of understanding, especially about trans folks, to generate fear and to distract people from the economic damage that folks on the right are inflicting on everyone. And their message is to be afraid of trans folks, and the attacks keep coming because that message is working. And so I feel like this is, our community is being dumped on, being harmed in very significant ways, not because of anything we've done, but because we are politically useful to certain powerful folks in the country. Precarious, I think, describes the state of the movement because so much hangs in the balance at the moment. We have made tons of progress, as Kira said, as I think everybody has said, and including on trans rights issues. But we are now going backwards on trans rights in this country. And if this continues, we'll be in a disastrous position. But I also included opportunity because I do feel like our movement is, as strange as it seems, in a moment of opportunity. Many, many movements want to change the public's mind about something. And the hardest thing for so many movements is just to get the country's attention to their issue. And for better or worse, the country is paying attention to LGBTQ issues and to trans issues especially. Now, they're not thinking about it or talking about it through the right lens, not at all. But we have a conversation that started, and it's up to us to change the way that conversation is going. And so that is the opportunity for how we make progress going forward. And so I ultimately, fundamentally, am still optimistic in the middle of a whole lot of awfulness.
Well, thank you all. Every one of those could lead down a whole path of conversation, in and of itself. And I'm sure that some of those are going to recur, as we move into the conversation. So I want to turn to some questions that I'll direct to one or another or a couple of you at a time. And let's start with one of the things that came up often in the questions submitted by folks attending tonight, and that was around the midterms. So I mean, after what seemed like ages of campaigning and tsunamis of political ads and everything else, the midterms finally happened. And we all know that the result was that the House is going to move over to Republican control, and Democrats have held on to the Senate. We'll find out by how much, depending on what happens in Georgia tonight. So what do you see? And I'm going to start with you, Kira, there in DC, on this. What do you see as some of the main implications for our community from the results that just have come in the last few weeks?
I think there are a couple of things that come up for us, for me. One of the things that people kept talking about, this big fear of having a red wave, right? That they were going to sweep the midterms, right? Like we were all bracing ourselves for the absolute worst. And it's undeniable. We had some real losses, devastating losses that are going to be felt for generations even. And we had some real wins, right? The numbers of LGBTQ people who were elected to office, right? There were some like knock down, drag out battles where we came out on top. And it was because we did so much work to turn out, right? LGBTQ people of color in particular, Black women showed up and showed out. And young people, right? Like, unfortunately, young people get a really bad rap. It's like every generation, it's like people are like, where are the young people? And then it's like, young people are going to save the world. It's like, yeah, no shit. Like, yeah, they're always at the forefront of movements, civil rights movements, abolition, right? Rights to vote. And they are also at the forefront, and they are going to be there as we fortify and strengthen this democracy. I do think there is some real fear about, what we're going to be able to do, right, in the next Congress. And again, we're going to have to, pool resources and work like hell, right, to both work on the congressional level, but we can be looking at administrative offices, right? There's a lot of work that can be done with HHS, that can be done with the Department of Health and Human Services, with the Department of Education. And frankly, we really need to be paying attention and doubling down on our work in the states. And I think that is also a real significant part of our work. Not that we need to abandon a federal strategy, because we can't do that either. And I think national and state and local groups have to be forging a strategy on multiple fronts, and a new and additional attention on state legislation.
Well, thank you. Andy, I want to pose the same question to you for another perspective on the midterms and their implications for our movement, our communities.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Kara shared, and I would add, for me at TILDAF and my colleagues, including those at the Transgender Law Center, at the National Center for Transgender Equality, we were monitoring the midterms, and no surprise, given what's happened over the past couple of years, trans folks became the latest boogeyman, and certainly showed up in the midterms, especially with what we're seeing play out in Georgia, with Herschel Walker running anti-trans messaging in campaign ads. And Herschel Walker isn't the only one. There are many hopefuls that ran on platforms that included anti-trans messaging, particularly attacking our young people. And I think I said this last year, but we have never seen these kinds of unprecedented attacks on minors ever, to the extent that we are witnessing what's playing out today. So that obviously is new and concerning. And for, I think, many parents in particular of trans children, they are scared. And they have suddenly become political footballs when simply they want to raise their children. That's all they want to do. They want to make sure that their babies are able to grow up, be able to go to school, get a good education, have access to quality, excellent healthcare. And yet we are seeing that trans kids are now the latest scarecrows of the political midterms. I would also add too that in light of the anti-trans attacks, we've also seen a lot of anti-Asian, anti-Black, just downright racist messaging also show up in the midterm elections. And what has been also really exciting to see is that folks who are under 18, as well as just celebrated their birthdays and are voting for the first time, they're pushing back and they're making their values known by going to the voting booth and voting for what's right. And I think that as much as we thought we would see this terrible red wave, we didn't. And I think I'll go a step further and say that, you know, normally when we look at midterms with presidents in office, we usually see massive shifts, right, with the other party, and yet we saw very little movement, which means that folks like us, we did the right thing, we are doing the right thing, and we are holding the line. The last thing I'll add, though, is it's not just about what's happening in red states, it's not just what's happening in purple states, it's what's happening even in blue states, something that, you know, Assemblymember Lowe mentioned earlier. Here in New York, we had a minute where we thought that Lee Zeldin, one of the gubernatorial candidates, was actually going to come out ahead of Governor Hochul. And this is in New York, right? This is a Republican candidate who ran on an anti-everything platform, including anti-LGBTQ, was a close ally to Trump. And in New York, we almost had a moment where we thought, oh no, what happens in the event that Lee Zeldin is elected to office? So it's not just what's happening in the heartland of the country. It's not what's happening in the south of the country. It's happening everywhere, and that requires everyone to remain vigilant and to stay organized.
Well, thank you, Andy. And actually, I want to go back to the federal level in a moment, but I also want to make sure that we take some advantage of your presence, Assemblymember Lowe, while we've got you. So I want to pick up off of the state part that you just made, actually both of you were just talking about. So if we shift our focus for the moment from the national level to California, we know from years of advocacy and organizing and legislative leadership that we've got some of the best protections in the whole country. And so thank you for your part in helping to make that the case. And as you look now, and kind of going back even to what you were saying before in response to the first question, what do you see as kind of the agenda, legislative or perhaps broader, for LGBTQ the movement here in California?
Thank you, Roger. For those of you who may remember, back in 2008, there was Proposition 8, which eliminated the rights of same-sex couples to marry in the state of California. That unfortunately passed. So that's actually still in our California state constitution. So it is our desire and intent to repeal that provision and enshrine protections for LGBT individuals in the state of California, especially in light of the Roe v. Wade decision. So what's important is that we think about enshrining protections. We can't take anything for granted. But what we also know, even in California at the state level, the conservative movement has taken a very surgical approach to run candidates at the local school board level. Now, oftentimes these are innocuous positions, nonpartisan, but they set significant policy on school curriculum. And you're seeing these being mirrored throughout the country, and individuals infiltrating our public school system, getting on school boards. They're typically anti-vaccination, anti-LGBT type of advocates. And this is very harmful. We've seen this widely covered, frankly, through national publications as well. So this reaffirms our commitment to helping ensure that we also similarly get individuals from our communities to go out, not just necessarily at the state level, but also at the local levels as well, to participate, to run for school boards. And not everyone is best equipped to run for office. We understand that, but make sure that you identify and know who your elected representatives are so that we can hold them accountable. And maybe perhaps as an active citizen, asking your local school board to pass resolutions on Transgender Day of Remembrance, to talk about the importance of members of our community so that we can help ensure that we have the stability and the recognition that we so importantly deserve.
Well, thank you. And I want to just stick with you for a moment again, because I know you're going to have to cut out early. Knowing that there's so much playing out at state levels, and and we'll go back to this whole panel, in a little bit. But are there any things that you and your colleagues, or that you can think of that here in California we might be able to do to in respectful ways to be able to help and support the movement and efforts in states that are harder states, for our community? I mean, typically redder states are harder states. And I'm sure there's been conversation among you and some of your colleagues, both nationally and statewide. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
There have been a number of conversations, for example, for a number of states in the Western region to come up with some state compacts, which is for states to mirror similar legislation and hopes of potentially getting to a critical mass of even a constitutional amendment interchange at the federal level, to helping to ensure that states pass resolutions so that we can get to the point where we look at the sensible type of firearm regulations that exist. These are important things in which we mirror legislation. Could we then perhaps have Nevada, Washington, and other places mirror these types of legislation? And so we are having real-time conversations about what these pieces of legislation look like, but we're also playing defense as well. Similarly, with the Don't Say Gay legislation in Florida, a number of other red states have mirrored those type of unfortunate type of attacks to victimize our community. And so while we're playing offense, we also play defense as well, and having those type of conversations. But one point that's abundantly clear too, this past midterm election, Governor DeSantis won by close to 20 points. And he has been the architect in having a sense of ownership of this difficult, this harmful rhetoric at our expense in our community. And what we need to recognize is that this could potentially be a blueprint for others to emulate, and we cannot allow that to continue. And we must not play nice anymore. We must be also similarly on the offense. And Roger, you may have seen similarly Governor Newsom taking the offensive approach to utilizing the interpretations of the Supreme Court on firearm regulations as well, and going after individuals in terms of liability and making sure that those who possess firearms are equally liable. So that's part of that conversation from the progressive movement about how to go on offense. We no longer just simply be on defense, and I'm hopeful that we can provide those type of resources as well.
Well, thank you. So I want to now just switch back to the federal level for a moment, and then we'll go back to the states. So the Respect for Marriage Act is on its way toward President Biden's desk, and it's unquestionably a big deal to have this legislation go through both houses of Congress, and even with a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. How excited should we be about this legislation, and how much does it actually change? And is there any chance for the Equality Act which would guarantee just anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people in public accommodations and housing. I mean, one of the holy grails of our movement. Is there any chance that there's going to be movement on that before we see this switch in the House of Representatives? So James, I'm going to start with you on that.
Sure. So I'll start out, and then I'm sure other folks will have views on this as well. So let's start with the Respect for Marriage Act question. Your question is, I guess, how excited should we be about it? I think we should be excited about it. We shouldn't be overly excited about it. I mean, but there are some really good things here. One is this bill has passed the House with, I think, 47 Republican votes and the Senate with 12. That is the high water mark to date ever in our history for congressional support for any LGBTQ measure. And so that is something to celebrate. And that comes after, this community did an enormous amount of work over the course of decades to move policy and move public opinion. And this is, the result of that. It's also something to celebrate because if we get to a place where the Supreme Court overturns the United States versus Windsor decision that struck down a core piece of the Defense of Marriage Act, then this bill, when it becomes law, because I'm sure it's gonna be voted on in the House, and it's going to pass the House again, and the president will sign it. This law will protect us, but it'll protect us just in this primarily in the following context, which is if you're already married, the federal government will continue to respect your marriage for all federal benefit program purposes. That's not a small thing. That's a very big thing. The Respect for Marriage Act doesn't mean that any state that doesn't want to issue a marriage license to a same-sex couple is going to have to. They won't have to. And it's likely, but not crystal clear, that the Respect for Marriage Act will mean that if you live in a state that won't let you get married in this future world that we're worried about, it should be that you can go to another state, get married, come back home, and this law will require your home state to respect that marriage. There are some technical questions in there about whether that's really going to work or not. I'm hoping that it does, but it's not guaranteed. But look, this is the best we could do in terms of an insurance policy in case the Supreme Court does to the LGBTQ equality decisions what it did to the abortion decision. Briefly on the Equality Act, look, my prediction is that it doesn't get passed, doesn't get a vote in the Senate in the days that are remaining in this Congress, and then we have to start from scratch again with the new Congress. And look, the Equality Act is an essential thing. We absolutely need it, even though the Bostock decision from the Supreme Court in 2020 gives us many, but not all of the protections that we need in terms of federal civil rights protections. But look, it's not surprising to me that we're having trouble with the Equality Act. On the one hand, the public is very much with us in terms of general support for non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. But the issues that are also in the Equality Act are all of the issues that, or so many of the issues that are the flashpoints in the attacks on LGBTQ people and especially trans people in the States. So to get the Equality Act passed, you've got to get to a compromise with a bunch of Republicans on a whole bunch of trans rights issues: restrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, healthcare. All of those things are things that are centrally relevant to the non-discrimination prohibitions that are in the Equality Act. And the other side wants to know, well, what does it mean in this context? What does it mean in that context? Those are obstacles for us. And the other set of issues is religious exemptions, like the Supreme Court case that was argued on Monday. And we, to put it mildly, do not agree, I think, as a community, with a bunch of the folks that we would have to agree with if we were going to get to a place of agreement on exemptions. So that's not to say that we can't get to a place where we can have come to agreement on language that would pass, but we're not there now.
Thank you. Sarah, not to pick on you, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that. Again, I mean, I know you're there in DC, and you and your team are all over these kinds of things, and I'm curious what thoughts you might have.
I am rarely like rendered speechless, and James just hooked it all the way up. I mean, I co-sign on everything James said, and ditto, ditto, ditto. And I guess what I would add is we are back at an opportunity, right? It's what James was saying, right? It's what we're all saying, right? Assemblymember Lowe, right? We've got to play defense and offense, right? The reality is we are at a time where we have to refight fights already won. So it's hard to be excited, right? Like when you're like, but I already won that game. What do you mean I got to replay the game to win the trophy I already got, right? Like, so that's hard, right? Like, and there's a real tax, right, on people who are on the front lines doing that work, doing that fight, folks who've already won that fight, right? I think about my mom. My mom was almost in tears watching, sitting outside my nephew's school, watching them load books out of the school into trucks, right? Like listening to these legislators and this critical race theory, right? She was born in 56, right? So again, we have to fight for things we thought we could close the door on, right? Our civil rights leaders are like, where the Voting Rights Act, this should be easy to expand. Why are we rolling it back, right? We're back at Jim Crow laws again. And so it's not necessarily the best, most fun place we want to be, and it's essential work that we have to do. And we are all really clear that holding the line while it's necessary is not end game. We've got so much more work to do. And so we've got to consider, where do we need reinvestments, right? Continued investments. We need to be thinking about what our investments are going to need to be in the next 6 months for 2024. We shouldn't be thinking about 2024 and 2024. We're already behind the game. We need to be thinking about 2024, 2026, right? 2028, and thinking about what investment looks like right now so that we don't have to get ready, but we can be ready for these fights that are coming.
Okay, well, thank you. So what I'd like to do is I would actually like to sort of jump back now to the states a little bit more broadly, because one of the things that's come up, and you know, of course, so I think that we're all well aware of, are the number, just the unprecedented number of attacks, and including, as you were saying, Andy, you know, attacks on the access of minors to, you know, to in some cases even like, you know, basic health care that we're seeing in state after state after state after state. And you know, this is not the first year that that's happened, but you know, I think it's been a record-breaking year in the worst way around that, and we probably don't have a lot of reason to be terribly optimistic that that's going to slow down very much, you know, in the next, you know, year or so. How is it, and I will note that our organizations and our allies have managed to repel a lot of those attacks through, you know, tremendous amount of very, very hard work and resources and organizing. But I'm curious from any and all of you, are there things that we as a movement should be thinking about or maybe doing differently, or anything else that we can try to help turn more of the tide on what's happening in so many of the states and impacting, of course, so many people in our community, especially folks in the trans community, but across the community as well? Andy, do you want to, I see you leaning forward. Do you want to start out that one?
So if we were to look at this year alone, we saw in total about 300 anti-LGBTQ bills show up in state legislatures across the country. And what was already, I think, alluded to, but just confirm right now, majority of those bills were anti-trans. They were explicitly anti-trans state bills, largely focused on two themes. One, to ban transition-related care or medicine for young people, trans young people. So to criminalize the relation, essentially the patient-doctor relationship with trans minors and their parents who are supporting them in that process and assisting with those decisions. We also saw the second theme, again, be around sports and access to being able to play. not just extracurricular sports, but school athletics, and putting trans young people again in a really difficult spot where they have to defend their identity, not just to their peers, but to their teachers and the school administrators, or even their school boards for that matter. And I want to also contextualize this because I think we were teasing this out a little bit earlier. This is a red herring, right? We know that trans issues are being used as a wedge issue in states across the country, to galvanize the base, to also use as political cover to elect anti-equality candidates. But it's also trans people are being used as one spoke of many in a wheel to not just attack trans people in accessing medicine from qualified, competent, and highly specialized doctors, but it's about eroding confidence in public health. It's about eroding confidence in evidence-based science. When we talk about schools, it's about eroding public confidence in public education, something that this country has always stood behind, and yet we are seeing continue to be chipped away, and this time around, trans people are being used to chip away at public education. So, as much as it has been yet another terrible year for trans people, particularly trans young people, it's also been a terrible year for, again, attacking science, attacking medicine, and also attacking institutions that in this country we value and we've come to accept. So what can we do? What are the solutions? How do we move forward in all of this? I think there are a few things. One, we continue to litigate. There are litigation groups, including TILDEF. I know James and his team is been very busy this year and last, and will continue to be busy. We have our other colleagues at NCLR, at Single A GLAD, Lambda Legal. We are all ready to litigate, and we'll continue to litigate in next state ledge. So that's a guarantee. But the proactive work that individuals can engage in on a day-to-day basis is, one, to engage with school administrators, to make sure that students are able to access school supports that we all have come to know, whether it's a GSA or a diversity club, or making sure that school districts have inclusive non-discrimination policies on their books, or anti-bullying policies on their books. Individuals can reach out and make sure that these supports are in place for our young people. Secondly, we have to shift the narrative. We are getting our butts kicked by our opposition. And I'm going to go a step further and say that they have learned a great deal from our movement. And I think in particular, the movement around marriage equality in this country. We know, and we learned in the lead up to Obergefell, that in order for us to get the rights that we all deserve, we have to talk about the personal stories. We have to change hearts and minds. And many of our opponents, ranging from the Heritage Foundation to Concerned Women for America, the Family Research Council, all of these organizations over the years have invested heavily in their comms infrastructure. They've blown up their communications teams. They've grown their platforms, their social media platforms. They've developed really sophisticated content to reach movable middle audiences. And we absolutely need to reinvest in changing the narrative by sharing our personal stories.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And that was such an important part of that one very successful fight around marriage. I know that Assemblymember Lowe, you have to cut out in just a minute or two. So I just wanted to turn to you, whether it's on this topic or anything else, if there are any further thoughts that you'd like to share with the folks who have joined us here tonight.
Well, I want to acknowledge the opportunity for you to provide space for us to reflect and have dialogue on the state of the movement and what we need to be doing to help ensure that those who are watching and those who are not watching understand the obligation that we have to each other to advance our community. But one final thought also similarly is we need to make institutional change. in California, we passed a law that required minorities and LGBTQ plus individuals on corporate boards. 20% required on corporate boards of those companies incorporated in the state of California. Why is that important? I referenced earlier the piece of legislation that we passed to prevent public subsidized travel to states that discriminate based on sexual orientation. That came about because corporate America had swift reprimand in Indiana and places like Georgia, and the NCAA and others said that they would no longer host their conferences in these states. Unfortunately, it's almost like whack-a-mole that this is now the new normal, and corporate America just says, well, we can't fight in all these different states. We cannot allow that to be the new normal, and then we cannot allow that to be acceptable. So the call to action is to help to ensure that we're looking at corporate America, asking for representation on corporate boards so that they can use the pocketbook and the power of the purse to help ensure that they are effectuating change to conservative legislators who are listening to them with the respect to helping ensure that there's the commonality that exists in helping to ensure that it's not just good business, but it's good for individuals in your states. So that's where I think there is a significant amount of work to be done, that we must reassure and get corporate America to realize the importance of their engagement in this space as well, and to not shy away from the importance of getting in the arena. So I appreciate the time here, and I know that you'll understand after this election cycle, we are now going to the swearing in ceremonies for the local school boards and city councils. So I'm going to do that here shortly. All politics is local, but I appreciate, again, each and every one of you for being fierce warriors, and I'm excited for the future ahead of us.
Thank you, Assembly Member. So I want to now just pop back for a quick moment to, actually it can't be a quick moment if we're talking about the states and what's going on in the states, but just following up on what some of what Andy shared. If either of you, Kira or James, had anything you wanted to add around the conversation around what the heck do we do around what's going on in the states, and it does not appear in any danger of letting out.
Yeah, so this is James. I would like to jump in for a minute.
Sure.
And it's not in anything, there's no prospect of this attack or serious attacks letting up. I co-sign everything that Andy laid out. And I want to add that I think we are, one of the reasons that we are not doing as well as we need to in terms of changing the narrative and fighting back against the attacks on trans non-binary people is that what you would think of as our base, the base for our movement, much of our community is not exactly against us on this stuff, but they're not sure how to talk about it. They're confused. They're not educated well enough. They're not comfortable in this space. And so when we think at the ACLU about, well, so, what are we trying to accomplish? Obviously, we're trying to move the public as a whole, but before we can move the public as a whole, we have to move the well-meaning liberal. We have to move our base and educate our base so that our base understands the trans justice issues that we're confronting and the issues and can see through and talk back to the misinformation and mischaracterization of the issues and frankly, the lies that advocates on the other side are pushing. And so this is stuff that, what this means is all of us have a bunch of learning to do. All of us have a bunch of talking to do to everybody in our lives. And one thing, Roger, your question was, what can we do? There's a bunch of stuff like the movement has to do, and we're trying. But there's also stuff that each of us as individuals can do. And that is learn more about how to talk about these things. And if you go to the websites of the organizations that are on this call, you will find a bunch of information. And if you don't find that, get in touch with Roger and tell him to yell at us and get the insights to or links to places where you could find that. There's stuff that we can learn. We've got to learn that. I have been on a learning curve in this job for 20 years and it's still steep and I'm learning every day. And it's hard, but it's worthwhile. So that is something that we can do. And that's like when you hear something kind of weird, someone says on the bus or someone says in a conversation with you, you will be in a position to engage and to push back and help other people learn.
So I want to switch for a moment or switch a little bit from something that is very challenging and in some ways can be, a little bit depressing, just what we're looking at in the States. And to talk about some bright spots. We hear often around the LGBTQ movement, but also around other progressive movements about the importance of being able to work across movements and to work in coalitions and all that. And I think we all know how powerful that can be when that actually happens. As you look around, whether within the LGBTQ movement or perhaps outside of it entirely, where are you seeing examples of where folks really are doing that and where they're really gaining some traction? And what are the kind of examples that are out there that we as a movement need to be paying attention to and learning from so that we can build stronger coalitions, on all the fronts that we need to work on? Kiara, I know you're a movement person.
Gets me
You all are, but I know you
really
are.
excited. It gets, I think, to the well-positioned, right, word that I used earlier. I can't pinpoint exactly why this is, but our organizations are moving, right? Like we are operating in an intersectional way, like I feel like we've never done before, or maybe I shouldn't say never in my time, because there's a whole lot of organizing that predates me. But in the last 25 years, we've talked like philosophically, right? Folks got intersectionality, but oftentimes had a really difficult time figuring out what that meant practically. Like, what does it mean to work at an intersectional issue or at an intersectional place without doing everything, right? And it might have been 4 years under that dude, the orange man. It might be, 2 years, 3 years in COVID, but there's more organizing happening and cross strategic work happening in so many places. So reproductive health rights and justice in the LGBTQ movement, right? Like there's always been a foundational, right, similarity. We are built on very, right, similar foundational values, right, goals, ways of thinking about who we should be allowed to be and not prescribed to. And yet, like the work has become less transactional, right? There are numbers of us that have gotten together over the last couple of years to think about not just what am I doing at your conference, but how can we talk about telemedicine and how that is both the solution for gender affirming care and increasing or protecting abortion access? What does it look like to have those conversations together, right? What does it look like in these places in the Bible Belt, my voice is giving out, stop, in the Rust Belt, where it is clear that we have the same enemy, if you will, right? Like we're seeing censorship, right? Attacks on information, control over body, whether that is control over trans bodies, control over who can make babies and not, right? We're seeing attacks on voting rights, right? Access to the political system. All three of these things are happening in these places, and advocates, leadership, Congress, or legislators are starting to come together and really think, not just philosophically, but practically, right? How that goes, how those things can go together. And that is really exciting.
Andy, and/or James?
Well, sorry, y'all, I'm going to be a broken record, at least for Kara and James. I was sharing some bright spots yesterday at a separate meeting that we were all at. But look, I want to lift up, I think, 2 examples, and they're actually tied to healthcare. So at TILDEF, we have what we call our Trans Health Project, and it's explicitly focused on eliminating transgender-related exclusions in health insurance plans, both in public or private. And we've been engaged in this work for about 2 years, and we have 2 lawsuits. Sometimes we have to sue bad actors in Georgia and North Carolina. And they were both similarly focused on removing blanket exclusions from public employee healthcare plans. In North Carolina, we're representing a group of folks that work for the state of North Carolina, some of whom are trans, and some of whom are parents of trans children. And the North Carolina Public Employee Healthcare Plan had a number of blanket exclusions preventing trans folks from being able to get the kind of coverage they deserve for transition-related needs. In Georgia, we represented a trans woman in a very rural county who had been working for her county for about 17, 18 years, still works there, and was also denied coverage for her transition-related needs. We filed lawsuits, federal lawsuits, and this year we were very proud to announce that we set precedent in the South by winning both of those lawsuits and securing 2 court rulings, the first one in Georgia, followed by the one in North Carolina, that explicitly found that an employer cannot exclude or deny coverage, transition-related coverage for trans people. And this was in the South. And I'll go a step further and add, we won because of Bostock. This is exactly what James was talking about earlier. Bostock has offered us a number of opportunities to pursue in not just advancing protections for our community, but also making sure that we're able to defend them well. So 2 wins this year. The second bright spot that I would point to is we don't always sue institutions or entities in order for us to have impact. And in fact, we prefer not to sue in some instances because lawsuits take a lot of time, they take a lot of money. And at TILDEF, we use something called alternative dispute resolution. Essentially, that's a fancy term that means we invite the other party to the table and say, hey, look, we're representing a number of clients who have been impacted by your healthcare plans that exclude coverage for trans folks. Would you be willing to join us at the table and resolve this out of court? This year, we announced that the United Steelworkers, I'm so excited to talk about this. We were able to work with the United Steelworkers. Their workforce constitutes about 30,000-ish folks, and they removed their blanket exclusions from their health insurance plans, the entire United Steel workforce. What I'm really excited about this is because for me, that's an intersectional issue, right? We're not just tackling trans issues there, we're also tackling working class issues. And it was really exciting to be able to announce that, as well as earlier in the formation of the project, we announced a similar win with the railroad industry. We were able to convince them to come to the table, and they've removed their exclusions in being able to work out a mutually beneficial resolution to the question that we posed to them. So we are winning, and we're winning in small and big ways. And I oftentimes think that, in light of all of the headlines that we're seeing, and rightfully so, about all the challenges that our movement is facing, there are still moments of victory in perhaps places that I don't think many of us would have anticipated or expected.
Thank you for that. That itself is inspiring, to use one of your words from earlier on. We can't have something that, and I'm now moving into questions that are inspired by the folks all of you attending who submitted questions in advance, and a number of them, no surprise, centered around the courts, and it's very hard to talk about the state of the movement without talking about the courts, both places where we're being able to utilize those in really effective ways, and other places where, of course, we're seeing some roadblocks. And I'm sure everyone on the Zoom was horrified by the Dobbs decision. And of course, that's not the only thing that a hard right-leaning Supreme Court has done, or unfortunately is likely to do. And James, I'm going to kind of look to you first around this. I know you eat this stuff for breakfast. Is how is it that we can strategize best when we know for almost certainty that the Supreme Court in particular, as well as some of the lower federal courts, the Supreme Court in particular, is leaning so deeply conservative and probably will for a period to come.
So this is a question I get a lot, and it's a very real question, because of course, as you know, we all know, this U.S. Supreme Court has actually been very good to us, at least over the last decade or so. Some of our greatest wins in terms of getting rid of the Defense of Marriage Act and striking down the remaining bans on the freedom to marry, and also giving us the non-discrimination protections for trans and LGBT folks through the Bostock decision that we've mentioned a couple of times. Those are big deal changes that have transformed the lives of many people in our community. But yeah, the Dobbs decision made it crystal clear to all of us that this court is not going to be our friend on most issues. But for me, that doesn't mean that we can just switch our focus to other kinds of advocacy and give up on the courts in any way. And that's for two reasons, at least two reasons. One is, if you look around, we are still, as a movement, winning in the lower federal courts. And what Andy just talked about is great evidence of that. There's a bunch of good law that goes our way, and we are using those statutes and those constitutional protections to protect people in our community. In addition to the stuff Andy mentioned, federal judges have struck down healthcare bans in Arkansas and Alabama, sports bans in Idaho and West Virginia and Indiana, including in cases where the judges involved were very conservative judges appointed by President Trump. So some of this stuff is just, some of these judges are just, straight shooter judges, despite who appointed them. And some of the situations are just where the law is clear. And the reality is the U.S. Supreme Court could change that law, but they can't take up all of these cases. So we can fix a bunch of stuff through the courts still, even though it is absolutely true that we cannot rely on fixing everything through the courts. But the other reason that we can't afford as a movement to turn away from litigation and from the courts in a full-throated, serious way is that we are not the only advocates who are focused on making change through the courts. Our opponents have, in some senses, learned from us about how to use the courts to make social change, their kind of social change, and organizations like ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and its ilk, they are using the courts to create their preferred world. And so in this context, what really we need to do is damage control. We need to engage in these cases brought by the other side to try to limit the scope of the loss wherever possible. And that means that winning in some of these cases looks and feels different than it used to. We are like wins going forward are not going to be like Obergefell, and they're not even going to be like Bostock. They're going to be like dodging bullets or turning what could have been a broad loss into a narrow loss. And that is challenging for our community, and it's challenging for our staffs of our organizations. It's challenging for the donors who help support the work. It's challenging for all of us, but it's essential in my view that we sort of start to make that shift in our heads about what litigation can get us, because it can get us some wonderful wins like what Andy was talking about. It also can do damage control and harm reduction.
Thank you. Several other questions touch on what broadly could be called economic and access issues, such as affordable housing, access to healthcare. And we know that in kind of everyday news, as some of the folks writing in questions said, we read about inflation, people are worried about a recession. Of course, this affects people across the country, within our community and beyond. Are there particular ways in which LGBTQ people may be especially vulnerable to some of these economic impacts that people are living with and struggling with, access to necessities of life like affordable housing and access to, say, healthcare and other necessary services? Okay, do I have to pick on someone?
I can start. I mean, the short answer is yes, right? Economic justice issues, of course, are LGBTQ issues. You know, one of the things that has been, again, really inspiring in my couple of years in this movement is to have seen the number of LGBTQ organizations fighting for a federal minimum wage, understanding, right, that there's this narrative somehow that LGBTQ people have all this money, right? Our movement for a long time has been raced white, gendered male, and classed rich, right? And we know that the reality of that is just not true. In fact, when we're talking about the benefits, right, of you know, we're fighting for that folks have access to through marriage, right? When we're talking about benefits that people have access through veterans benefits, when we're talking about, right, these kinds of benefits, we our people don't have access to them, which puts them at a disadvantage, right? And as elders, as dependents, not to mention there's still discrimination in jobs, right? Like people are not guaranteed the ability to get and keep quality jobs and upper mobility, and the gig economy is real, right? The you know, the research is showing, right? You know, when you look at, and Andy, you may be able to speak to this even more than I can, but we're looking at the research that has come out that has looked at how many people who are non-binary and trans that fall below the poverty line. It's like it is real, and we've got to be thinking about like these moments again, these flashpoints that aren't necessarily thought of as LGBTQ issues, where we are undeniably disproportionately impacted, but are often not the center of the research or the data collection. We are not often the voices, right, that are telling the stories. We are not at the table to talk about what the solution should and could look like, so that they impact our communities in the ways that we need them to. So those are those are a couple.
James or Andy?
I'll just to hop in and build off of what Kira was sharing, very anecdotally, as one of our approaches to the work at TILDEF, we do offer legal services to folks in the community. And last year, we served a little over 600 individuals, predominantly who were accessing legal services. Close to 60% of our clients who reach out to us and that we provide support to live below the federal poverty line. That's like less than $13,000 a year. And to paint a picture, many of our clients are in very insecure, unstable conditions. Many of them live in emergency housing, just a fancy way of saying shelter, or sleeping on someone's couch. And many folks struggle with accessing safety net benefits. And that was especially true during the onset of the pandemic. We actually started to survey early into the pandemic about people's experiences with accessing services during COVID, and also asking more specific questions about income tied to the pandemic. And the average income for almost all of our clients was $0. They weren't able to access safety net benefits that so many in our country were attempting to gain. And many times our clients were reporting that it was taking months for them to have their benefits processed so that they would be able to pay for groceries. So there's that. The second thing I would add is, and it's certainly tied to economic justice, it's also tied to health and well-being, is Medicaid plans. So in this country, states administer their own Medicaid plans. The federal government gives them a bunch of money, and then states are essentially able to set the terms of how they administer their Medicaid programs. And many of those programs have exclusions in them from preventing trans and non-binary folks from accessing transition-related care, let alone basic services with dignity, right? So there are a number of ways that we can slice and dice this, but when we talk about economic justice and when we talk about trans people, this is the daily lived experience, the actual daily lived experience for many folks in our community.
Thank you. We have time for one or two of the other areas that we had a number of people write in questions about. And one of them, I'm glad to say, is something that's just very practical. And that is a number of people asking variations on what is it that we, be it, donors or just, LGBTQ folks, who care enough about what is going on to want to attend something like this. What are a couple of things, concrete actions that people can take to try to help, move, part of or all of, our movement forward? And of course, I know that there's 150 of these, but what might be a couple that, in your view, might really stand out that could help make a difference and give people a point at which they could be really contributing? James, I'll pick on you first this time.
Okay, so, well, there's the bit I talked about earlier, just in terms of getting informed on the trans justice issues, and I've returned to it just because I think it is so essential to our collective ability to make progress going forward. I'll add supporting organizations in the states that are under attack, state-based organizations, especially the trans-led organizations in the states. These are the folks who are on the front lines. These are the folks who are taking care of the folks who are under attack. These are the folks whose voices we all need we need them to be in a position to stand up, to tell their stories, to go meet with legislators. And these are organizations that are routinely under-resourced, systematically under-resourced. And these are folks that, many of the national organizations that are on the call here and many others are working on the ground with various different folks, and we're doing what we can to support them, but they need help. And we can't do the work that we need to do without the partnership with them. So that's the thing to do in a way that your support for some perhaps out-of-the-way organizations could make a real big difference.
So James, is there a place that you could suggest to people, or Kara or Andy, either of you, that if someone wants to be responsive to exactly what you're saying, where they might find some information about what some of these organizations could be? They can certainly contact us here at Horizons, and we're happy to help folks out with that. But are there other things, web-based resources or other things that people might be able to access, specifically around what you were raising, James?
So I don't know of a central registry. Perhaps Andy or Kira does. I'll flag one organization that could absolutely use support, which is TENT. It's the Transgender Education Network of Texas. The Texas legislature is in session in January. It is going to be terrible. And those people can use some help and some love.
Well, James is not mincing words, so I'm gonna lean in to that and add, if folks have financial resources to move and are interested in supporting organizations during what we anticipate to be a bad state-led session in 2023, two places I would point to. One is the Trans Justice Funding Project. They are a community-based, community-run philanthropic organization that provides grassroots support to trans organizations across the country. And they maintain an active directory of organizations that they have supported in the past or are actively supporting now. It was founded by a trans leader by the name of Gabriel Foster, does amazing work, and I highly encourage folks to check out the Trans Justice Funding Project. The second resource I would point to is our friends at the Equality Federation. And James, thank you for naming 10. 10 is a member of the Fed. They are a statewide, one of the few trans-led statewide groups in the country, along with a couple of others. But I would highly encourage viewers to visit the Equality Federation website and look through all of the members, the statewide equality organizations who are a part of the Fed. It's not look, I want to contextualize this and say, absolutely adopt a trans organization in a red state, tithe, make a multi-year commitment, do what you got to do. But I would, so I'm all for that. And in states where there is limited to no infrastructure for trans organizations, oftentimes statewides have to fill in the gaps, very big gaps. And frankly speaking, there's a wealth of work that needs to be done in this coming session. So I would say, in states like Florida and Texas, there's the Trans Inclusive Group, but there's also Equality Texas, there's also Equality Florida, and in other states where there are again limited to no trans organizations on the ground, your next best bet would be go to the statewide and provide support, reach out, ask questions, and make a pledge.
Kira, anything you'd like to add to that, or like practical things that folks can do?
Oh my God, I wish I was sitting in a room with you all with, I don't know, tea, a whiskey. This is starting to get fired up. I love it. So a couple of things, triple down on all the things they said. If you can do it, C4 funding, right? A lot of our LGBTQ folks, right, organizations, they don't have the capacity to go beyond what a C3 allows them to do. And you can do a lot with a C3. And we're talking about getting political and getting more political. So if you have it, invest, right? Figure out where you can take a risk, right? Like if you're already making multi-year funding to the tune of 2 years, what would it look like to do 3? If you're doing 3, what would it look like to do 5? Like there are, right, folks in philanthropy that are pushing their needles and experimenting with that. So play in that kind of way. I would say invest time, people, and money in the Bible Belt, the Rust Belt, red, purple, of course, blue states as well. I speak as someone who was born and raised in Georgia. I do not live there now. Friends of folks who are leaving places like Texas, right? Leaving places like Alabama. The reality is, left of center political parties and organizations divested from these states a long time ago, and that is what's coming home to roost right now. We don't get to divest. In fact, we need to double down on what we've been doing. And I would suggest if you're not engaged with funders for LGBTQ issues, it's a great place to take a risk, right? There are other funders, program officers, presidents, CEOs, trustees who come to that space and they also don't know things, right? But there's a space for them to engage in questions that you might not be comfortable asking around other people, but you can do it in that space. You can have questions about how folks have expanded, right, their giving in trans communities, trans-led communities, trans organizations. You can have conversations about how you move from 101, right, to 301 in how you engage in community and on these issues, and with multiple intersectional, right, in multiple intersectional ways.
Right. Well, thank you. And for those folks, particularly in the Bay Area, but also beyond, that is something that here at Horizons, we are happy to help support folks around and to identify places where, your passion and what you want to accomplish, meets, some of the really, really deep needs of the community. We work with, more than 150 donor advised funds and, with all kinds of other donors every year. So if we can be supportive, of course, we're very happy to do that for you as well. I think we have time maybe for just 2 more quick questions, but I'm going to have to ask you to keep the answers, the responses pretty brief. We're down to our final 10 minutes or so here. The first question is, and this is completely unfair, so I'm sorry in advance, but it came up in some of the things that were submitted. Where do you see our movement in 10 years? Okay, crystal balls. Andy?
I'm going to give kind of a emotional answer. This past Trans Day of Visibility in March, TILDEF organized a delegation of 10 trans young people and their families to go to the White House and meet with senior members of the administration. And we did that because at that time, the headlines were constantly filled with so much uncertainty, a lot of bad information, and quite frankly, a sense of hopelessness in thinking about the state of the trans movement and the many challenges that our folks were facing, particularly in Texas, given the directive that Governor Abbott and Attorney General Paxton had put forward. And we had these 10 families and these young people, and they got to meet the vice president. They got to meet with Admiral Rachel Levine. They got the red carpet treatment. And in meeting with them and talking to them, you would have thought that there was nothing wrong in the world. I talked to one young trans man, and I was like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Just in a very cheeky fashion, I asked the question, and he said, "I want to be a business owner, and I want to own a chain of barbershops." And I was like, "Wow, that didn't expect the answer." And when I was thinking about how old I was at the time, I didn't have those kinds of specific answers. Another person said, "I want to be a producer for C-SPAN." Another person said, "I want to run for president." And I think about how old these folks are. They're about to graduate high school, or just about to finish up their final exams to get to that their senior year. 10 years from now, these folks are going to be almost in their 30s. And if 1% of their hopes and dreams come true, I don't have to worry about who's going to take the reins of our movement, who's going to sit at the helm of our organizations, who are going to come up with innovations, who are going to become successful entrepreneurs. That truly the sky is limitless, or the opportunities are limitless for our young people. And I think a lot of us in leadership right now, in our darkest moments, we wonder, what the future is going to look like. And whenever I speak to these folks, because we talk on a semi-regular basis, I am reminded that our movement's in good hands and is going, and what we are doing, we are adding to the legacy of our community and our movement, and they're going to be able to take us light years from where we're at today. So 10 years from now, I expect our young people to solve all the world's problems, problems that we as adults have probably caused, and to learn a thing or two from the next generation to follow. Because I mean, the fire, the energy, the brilliance, it's there. Our movement, it's going to be very exciting in a decade.
Thank you, Andy. James, Kira?
I love future conversations. I was writing down like how old my kids are gonna be in 10 years and how I'm gonna be exactly the same age in 10 years. And in in 10 years, the first thing that came to my mind is like a rainbow wave across the elections. We're gonna see like it's already right, it's happening. Like every year we just get more and more people running for office across the different kinds of um, you know, offices, state and local and national. I'm like I see a rainbow of folks running and coming into office at every level of government. I see a broad social justice movement that isn't trying to figure out where LGBTQ people fit. Like they're already clear about it and they're leveling up on it, right? The first Gen Z candidate made it to Congress this year. So we're gonna be right? We're gonna be, oh my God, and we're only getting queerer, right? Like we're only getting queerer. And that bodes well for us, I think. And I think in 10 years, we're really going to be grappling with a question that we're grappling with right now. And that's, what does resilience look like? How do we feed it, right? How do we continue to take care of, right, ourselves? How do we create a sustainable movement for justice? Because perspective tells us it's never done in our lifetime. It's never been done in any lifetime. So how do we continue to fortify and create, right, sustainable environments for this work to continue to level up and move forward?
Thank you. That's James. Any final words in our last minute or two?
Last couple of minutes. So look, I do think that we will be in a better place in 10 years. I don't think we're gonna be in a perfect place, but I don't hear anybody saying that quite yet. But here's what gives me hope. If you think about the journey that the LGBT community has been on from, let's say, 1960 until now, those changes are just mind-boggling, right? And they were unimaginable in 1960. There were criminal sodomy laws in every state. There was no relationship protection, and the idea of relationship protections was laughable. There was a ban on immigration. If you were gay, you couldn't work for the federal government if you were gay, blah, 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 blah. It just keeps going. And so much of that has changed. We are, not exactly at the beginning of that, of a similar trajectory, but we are nowhere near the end of the trajectory in terms of the movement on trans justice issues. And so we're going to be farther along, but we're also going to have suffered some serious policy defeats in the interim, sometime during these probably, unfortunately, in the next few years, coming from a combination of the state legislatures and potentially Congress and potentially this U.S. Supreme Court. And so we're going to have a bunch of digging out to do, but we're going to be in the process of doing that digging out, because I think this cultural change is going to happen. It's not going to happen on its own. We all have to make it happen, but we know how to make it happen because we did it already on LGBT stuff, and we can and must do it again. And we're on the journey. It's going to continue.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Well, all three of you, but also all four of you, including Assemblymember Lowe. And I find myself going back to some of the things that all of you said when I asked you initially about those three words. And because it's like we're both rocketing ahead, and we're also in some dangers of going backwards. It's like there's 1,000 reasons for hope and confidence, and 1,000 reasons also for worry and even fear. And I remember you're saying among you, we're both, exploited was one of the words. Resilient was also one of the words. Precarious was one of the words. Well-positioned was also one of the words. Defensive and inspiring. And like all of those things are true at the same time. And we know that history doesn't move in a linear way. And there are these wonderful moments, of advancement and momentum, that are just thrilling. I mean, kind of along the lines of what you had shared, Andy, in day. But history also has a way of reminding us that momentum is not destiny. And, there are no guarantees about things. And our ability to move forward is going to depend significantly on leaders like you, on what you and Andy, as you were talking about, and others, the next generation after that. So thank you for all of your extraordinary contributions to our movement, as well as to our time together tonight. And our future is also going to depend a great deal on all of the people who have joined us tonight, all of you who have attended. It's your support, it's your energy, it's your commitment, it's your passion, it's your gifts that are going to help lead us toward a world that we all aim for, we all dream of, which in the words of Horizons Foundation's vision statement is a world in which all LGBTQ people can live freely and together in time. I believe that we will indeed get there. But for now, I will just say thank you to everybody for joining us, and especially again to our panelists, and wish everybody a wonderful end of the year and beginning of the next. Thank you very much and good night.